Hello, this is the July 21st Burnaby LaRouche meeting. The next one will be August 4th, Saturday, August 4th at 6:30 in Burnaby. And by then, things might be very different. And again, if you wish to find out the specific address, email me at Paul, P-A-U-L, Glumaz, G-L-U-M-A-Z, @gmail.com. Okay. Tonight, I'm going to start with a tale from the crypt of my past. I'm going to take you back to approximately 3 years after I became active with LaRouche in 1977. I was active in upstate New York and Ontario. In that period of time, I was active in upstate New York and Ontario. And what I'm going to discuss tonight is a battle that took place between 1977 and 1980. This battle was around a bank that at that time was called Hong Shang. Because of us, they changed their name to HSBC. They didn't want to focus on the Hong and the Shang because of their notoriety in the both current and past. Now, in 1977, the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank made a move to purchase the stock in the Marine Midland Bank, which is primarily an upstate bank in New York. And this was the portal for bringing the drug money legally through Hong Kong Shanghai Bank into the U.S. Okay. Up to that point, there was a lot of drug consumption developing in the U.S., heroin, cocaine, etc. But the funds were leaving the country, and it was very difficult to launder the money, and the funds would leave the United States, but it was very hard to integrate the profits from the drug traffic into the takeover of the U.S. economy. So this was a move by Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. And our movement made a huge issue of this takeover. And we led a campaign to get the New York Bank superintendent, at that time was Muriel Seibert. We led a campaign to get her to reject the authorization of the takeover of Marine Midland Bank unless Hong Kong Shanghai Bank showed its books. And Hong Kong Shanghai Bank refused to show its books. So a 4-year battle emerged in which all kinds of pressures were brought upon Muriel Seibert from the governor, from the Federal Reserve, especially after Volcker became head of the Federal Reserve in 1978, to force this to occur. And the battle lines developed into the state legislature of New York, and our friends in the New York State Legislature put a bill to stop the takeover. The governor, Kerry, launched a campaign against those state legislators. This thing culminated in the purchase of Marine Midland Bank in 1980, 51% purchase of Marine Midland Bank by the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. But in the process of this campaign, a lot of forces came around to the bigger picture of the drug trade and the bigger picture of who was running the drug trade and the financial side of the drug trade. And this led to a lot of entities coming to us from law enforcement, international, domestic, intelligence people, many different forces came to us with the evidence and the knowledge of what was really going on. And out of this whole process came a book in 1978 called Dope Incorporated. And what was unique about Dope Incorporated was it didn't go into, it went into the concept of the drug traffic as a top-down organized structure, not as a bottom-up organized structure, but as a top-down organized structure centered on the banking side. And going back in history to the Opium Wars in China, and the way the China Opium War worked, the way the opium trade went into China, and how this was same principle was being replicated in the context of the Vietnam War, in the context of this whole process. And then we did an overlay of the growth of organized crime in the United States and the people involved in the Kennedy assassination, and we did a whole series of things to connect, and out of this came a conception of an imperial activity that was growing and growing in power, and that if you wanted to take down the drug trade, you couldn't do it by simple interdiction or rounding up all of the drug addicts or what have you. You had to go for the banking system. You had to go for the banking side as the first way you take it down. You don't. So now you have to understand that this caused a lot. This book, which unfortunately did not circulate as many in the millions. It was significant, but it wasn't in the millions. This book caused a total furor, and our campaign caused a total furor. And it's about that time that the forces that are still trying to stop us came into crudescence, sort of, came into a kind of together. They came together. It's around 78, 79, 80, 81. All the people who have been out to slander LaRouche, you know, the Queen of England runs drugs, political extremist, cult, everything stems from the 78 battle, 78 to 77 to 80 battle, where essentially we drew blood with this analysis, with the evidence in this book and everything. And one of the leading people who made his profession going after LaRouche, he wrote a book on it, was Dennis King. Another one was Chip Burley. And they were both involved as reporters and writers for High Times magazine. This whole apparatus came after us. Canon West of St. John the Divine Cathedral was a top level of the British in the U.S. told us that the British would not go after us directly, but they would sick their Jewish friends on us, meaning the ADL. And sure enough, the ADL went on a total campaign. LaRouche is an anti-Semite, LaRouche is a racist, LaRouche is this, LaRouche is that. And then we countered with another campaign showing that the leadership, historical leadership of the ADL had nothing to do with Judaism. It was an extension of the Freemasonic apparatus of the British, and their leadership was against having Jews leave Germany, and the fight that took place among the Jewish population against the bankers who wanted to keep the Jews in Germany, not allow them to emigrate during the Nazi period. And we had a huge battle with the ADL. We put out a book called The Ugly Truth about the ADL, where the top leadership of the ADL were part of the Purple Gang and organized crime and all of this. And we drew blood on them. They drew blood on us. We drew blood on them. So we fought back. And we caused them a lot of headaches. But this is where the whole thing started to take off. Because what we were doing was saying, this empire, which is British, centered in Britain, one of the key banks was the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. The other key bank was the Bank of Montreal. The other bank was New Westminster. Another bank that played a very key role is the Bank of Nova Scotia. We laid this all out in this book. Now, what's the significance of this? Well, they got the door open through the takeover of Marine Midland, and it was done because the Federal Reserve managed to override the state superintendent, and it went through. And I think Congress backed them up. So essentially, once this process began, then the drug funds began to come in as in the form of the Michael Milken business. How did this work? Well, if you're under a regulated banking system, you have credit, you have money circulating, but it stays pretty much tied up in loans and economic activity. If you deposit so much money in the bank, they can multiply the lending, and if a bank wants to do okay, they have to keep lending money out, and they lend money out to businesses and to commercial activity and to homes and to various different things. But where is the extra money to come in and do takeovers? Where is that extra money? How do you come in and with all this extra money and do all these takeovers? So what emerged from this period is the whole leverage buyout and junk bond system. A little bit deregulation of the laws, and then they went with the junk bond and leverage buyout. How did it work? You would float these bonds at very high interest rates. And this is all tied up with Volcker's high interest rates. You would float these bonds at very high interest rates, right? And so all this money would come pouring in to buy these bonds. All this loose money would come in to buy these bonds, and then you would go and use the bonds to buy the stock of a company or a corporation, and then you would take the existing debt of that corporation and the junk bonds and merge them into the new debt of the new corporation that was taken over, often in a hostile way. So all of a sudden you have Milken's Raiders, and you had the Predators Ball, and you have this whole process, and you look at Mitt Romney, he's a product of that whole stuff that got started in the 80s. And so what they would do is they would look at a company, right, a manufacturing firm. Now, if you're a manufacturing firm, you produce steel, you produce automobiles, you produce machine tools, whatever, right? It is in your interest as a company to keep your stock value low, because you want to keep the cash flow in the actual process of economics. Andrew Carnegie would not go for stock because he didn't want to have to pay. He didn't want to pay, because when you put out stock for capital, you now have stockholders, and you got to pay them a dividend. And Andrew Carnegie didn't want to do that. He wanted to have the money stay in the company for building new facilities for the cash flow. He didn't want to, he wanted to maintain the company and keep people at work, not pay off dividends. So the whole idea of Wall Street is you have to go to Wall Street and you have to create a stock, and then the stock, and so essentially, so now you have a situation where so companies would tend to try to depress the value of their stock, depress the because they wanted to preserve as much of the cash internally to keep the process going, to maintain the future costs of investment and what have you. So now the Raiders would then look at a company and say, well, if we were to break this company up and sell off every piece of it, it would be worth more than the stock of the company. Of course it's going to be worth more than the stock of the company, right? So that's what they would do. And then they would come in and strip. And that's how you ended up having all these things go overseas, because they would essentially break it down and take it overseas or do whatever. And so this was the whole process of looting that was set into motion in the wake of the decision around Marine Midland takeover by Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. And we were the movement at that time that was fighting it openly with Dope Incorporated and what have you. So I'm telling you this for a reason. I'm telling you this for a reason because this flagship financial institution was Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which is now called HSBC. And historically, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank was set up in Hong Kong to handle the financial side of the drug trade, and and the way it worked in China was the Chinese did not have any products that they really needed from outside of China that they couldn't produce themselves. The first thing that was used to try to open up China was seal pelts. Because the Chinese would make these beautiful seal coats, and they were like worth a lot in China. And so the whole fur trade that developed in the 1800 period to open up China was based on the fur trade, but it just wasn't quite enough to get all the gold and all the loot and everything out of China. But that was the first. They couldn't find a particular product that they could dump on China that the Chinese people would be interested in or would go for, because China was a large country with a lot of people, and they produced what they consumed. So what they did, and what they did is they decided to go with opium create an addicted population to opium, and open the doors for increasing the addicted population to opium, and then use that as and then these addicts would then be the criminal associations that would be involved in running the drugs in would become the underlings of the empire, basically the organized structure, organized criminal structure carrying out these things. And this is how they began to take massive amount of loot out of China, was by increasing the addiction of the population. And when the Chinese put up a fight on this, the British pushed free trade, meaning we have the freedom to get for these drugs to go anywhere in China, essentially, that you can't interfere with free trade. Now, Adam Smith talks about opium as being a kind of way to create a strong demand. Of course, supply and demand, right? What is the strongest demand that you can have in the market? Is when someone's addicted to something, that is the strongest demand that you can have in the market. So this was the kind of the essence of free trade economics historically, was centered in the drug trade. And the British then farmed out the slave trade to the Spaniards and went big with the drug trade, and they built up a network of Americans involved in the drug trade who would in turn continue on. So this history is very important to understand in connection with Hong Kong Bank and the future takeover of attempt to take over the world through the drug trade. And what's going on in Russia right now is an all-out assault with drugs, and Iran, the same thing, a lot of all-out assault with drugs, and India also. But the Chinese, that's why the Chinese have very strict laws about drugs, because they went through a horrifying experience of having large chunks of their population destroyed and die as a result of the drug trade and the looting of China. So now, keep what I just said in mind, because then I'm going to come back to it in the modern situation. Now, later, in the middle to late 80s, in 1971 you had the dollar taken off the gold reserve system, and by 1974, 3-4, you had essentially a large speculation in currencies, right? But up until the late 80s, middle to late 80s, the interest rates that were primarily set by central banks. The Federal Reserve set an interest rate for what it would discount, lend money to the banks, and that became the interest rate that the banks would use as their benchmark, and then they would, depending upon so-called risk, they would increase the interest rates, up a bit. So that was the way it would work in the U.S., and in England the same thing, and Great Britain the same thing, and other countries the same thing. Now, the problem with that is you can only make so much profit that way. So under Margaret Thatcher, there was a grouping that emerged which got the British to deregulate their this aspect, and something called the British Bank Association was set up with 18 of the top banks as members. I'm not sure exactly the number, and it was set up that they offered an interest rate based upon a averaging of a certain type of what they were getting their interest rate at. And it became known as the London Interbank Offering Rate. And gradually over time, this London Interbank Offering Rate became the floor interest rate for the entire world. For the US, for Europe, for the European equivalent, it became the floor of everything. Now what's this whole concept? The London Interbank Overnight Rate. What this means is the interest rates change daily. Every day a new interest rate comes in. Right? So what is having an unstable, rapidly changing interest rate? Well, in the past, most loans would be fixed at a certain rate. But now, if you fix a rate at a certain rate for a loan, how do you know what the interest rate is going to be from one day to the next? Just like with the currencies. So now you have to develop what's called a variable rate, which fluctuates. And then you have people going for a higher rate, which is or lower rate, and then long-term rates, and these are all fluctuating against each other. So now you have this kind of instability that requires that people hedge. That is, they hedge. If they're doing a fixed rate, they have to hedge on that fixed rate. So then the banks came up with something called interest rate swaps, where let's say you have a corporation or a smaller bank, or most of all counties and cities and pension funds and what have you, and let's say you want to borrow money, you want to float bonds for projects, or the city wants to issue bonds or whatever, and they issue them at a fixed rate. Then what you do is you take the currency swap to cover for if the interest rates go against you. But what the banks did is they made particularly in the last 5 years, the last 6 years, they made all of these entities pay more on their loss because they bet wrong with the banks than if they had not bet at all. So essentially, there's this huge swindle going on where it's come out that the banks colluded with each other and had foreknowledge with each other of what the interest rate was going to be. And this is a crime. Okay, so this is a crime. And the second aspect of this is that derivatives, which came into being in the 90s, early 90s, in the big way, and grew to what they are now, are also all based on interest rates, fluctuations. What's the basis for derivatives? The basis for a lot of the derivatives is what is the fluctuation going to be in the interest rates. But if the banks know in advance what interest rate is going to be the next day, who comes out the winner in the derivative gambling? The very people who run the system, right? So, but oh no, we don't rig this. We're honest people. We, all of that. So when 3 weeks ago or so, maybe less than 3 weeks ago, it came out in Britain that Barclays was involved in fixing the interest rates, and the head of Barclays had to resign, and then he was hauled up before the fraud committee in London, in the parliament, and the thing started to unravel. Okay. Now, did people know that this was going on? I think so, yes. There were articles in 2008 that came out on this in the Wall Street Journal, and there were all kinds of things happening, right? But it came out. So, now we're going to go back to Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, right? There are hearings going on in the House, in the Senate committee of Senator Levin. And a 330-page report was issued on the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. 1. 80% of the Mexican money is laundered through Hong Kong Shanghai Bank through their Mexican affiliate. Number 2, 60% of the drug trade in the United States is controlled by the Mexican drug gangs. Number 4, the former head of Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, Lord Stephen Green, is currently the trade minister in the Cameron government. He was also the former head of the British Bank Association. He also became an ordained minister.
One way to get saved.
Lord Green is being asked now to step down by the Labour Party in Great Britain. Okay. So, you have Hong Kong Shanghai Bank of people in the top levels, and the top people in the Irish Bank, Allied Irish Bank, I think it is, which is the primary recipient of the bailouts, is also connected to the Hong Kong Bank as well. So you have the personnel issue. Now, in the U.S., the controller of the currency has jurisdiction over compliance around money laundering issues. And the controller of the currency is under the jurisdiction of the Treasury Department, and the head of the Treasury Department is Timothy Geithner. And in the hearings, they started to go after the fact that the Treasury Department was essentially protecting Hong Kong Shanghai Bank's money laundering. And Geithner's response was that the control of the currency is not under his jurisdiction, but is an independent agency within the Treasury Department. Okay. So, essentially, this is big because these two things, the banking side of the drug trade and the LIBOR, are the two pillars financially of the empire that we're up against. That's their two pillars, believe it or not. The money from the drug trade and the organized apparatus that is connected to the drug trade on the one hand, and the manipulation and control of the interest rates at the center of the whole international system are the two pillars of the system. And they have they're being blown now. The two pillars of the system, and people don't quite fully yet realize what the consequences of all this, but up until Sergei Ivanov, the drug enforcement head in Russia, came out recently, or has been coming out, saying that Glass-Steagall is the way you shut down the drug trade, because it wipes out the ability of the financial system to have this system where, and that the whole financial system is being held together by the dollars which go outside the system the dollars from the drug trade go outside the system and are essentially coming back into the system, but they are at the center of this financial. So you got the drug money as the core of the financial system, and you have the interest rates rigging at the other core. Now, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank is also intimately involved with the principal Saudi Arabian bank, which is involved in the funding of terrorism. Okay. That bank, also the 9/11 crowd around Prince Bandar, had their money in Riggs National Bank in Washington, D.C., and when Riggs went under because of their criminal activity, they got took over by the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, by the HSBC. So you have the connection into terrorism, drugs, so forth. So the political side of the drug trade is the funding of international terrorism. Okay, so now you're beginning to put together this empire. Now, simultaneous to the revelations around LIBOR that emerged in Great Britain and what's unraveling in terms of prosecutions and other things that are now in the pipeline, you had a coming out of a whole section of the British establishment for permanent separation of the commercial with the investment, permanent separation of what they call the retail and the merchant banks, which is essentially saying we're going to wipe out all the large banks because that's what they are. They are not retail. That's the small part of it. We're going to split them up. What does that mean? That means they all get wiped out, essentially. So this is an element of the establishment which is connected to the Rothschilds, which has decided that this whole system isn't going to work. It's not going to succeed. The Russians aren't going along. The Chinese aren't going along. The Indians aren't going along. It's going to be nuclear war or total chaos, and we might as well go. We might as well, if we want to live for another day, we're going to have to go with Glass-Steagall. So, what this does is now you have for the first time internally in the system a split between the system that I'm describing, which is very nasty, versus the element that has decided that they're going to have to shut that system down, which is no easy job, by the way, because you know this thing has grown and gotten big and gotten real nasty and so forth. Now this then feeds into something called Fast and Furious, because Obama was involved in getting elected. Now Hillary was the front runner. Hillary Clinton was the front runner. She had the commitment. She had the base. She had built this thing up. How did he do it? Well, the word is that there was about $600 million, $600 million of illegal money came in under the table to get him the nomination. And that this money came from largely the drug trade and from the Mexican drug cartels. And so Fast and Furious is about the Obama administration funneling arms into the hands of the Mexican drug cartels so that they could take power inside Mexico. So that's essentially what Fast and Furious is all about. And that's why there's no documents being provided to the Congress yet, because one document leads to another. And so what am I getting at? What I'm getting at is that this is the system that has to be dismantled if you're going to save the human race, if you're going to save the nation, if you're going to have Glass-Steagall, if you're going to do all this. So that's the situation. So these are the two pillars of the empire, which are at the center of the empire. And now, for the first time since we published Dope Incorporated, since the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, this is the first time that any entity until recently, the Russians and Costa, who was head of the UN investigation on drugs. It's the first time that you have a presentation in outside of this movement of how this thing really works, and actually an open fight around precisely the very issue that this movement raised in New York State back in 1977-78 in the issue of the Marine Midland takeover of Hongshan Bank. So, I mean, of the Hongshan takeover of Marine Midland. And so it's very interesting, because if you're going to implement Glass-Steagall, if you're going to make this financial shift, you have to take down this criminal apparatus. Why? Because they're not going to let you implement Glass-Steagall. They're not going to let you survive because they're criminals. They have a criminal orientation. The higher level of it, these higher level oligarchs who are now going against them, they can survive. They're higher up. They have their assets in different places. They don't have their assets necessarily in the financial system. They have their assets maybe in gold mines or you know, real estate or whatever. But that system it has to come down if you're going to save yourself. And you have people like Obama and Timothy Geithner and Ben Bernanke. They're so embedded inside that system as you take that system down, they cannot escape criminal prosecution because they have committed crimes upon crimes upon crimes. They cannot walk away. They cannot let themselves just all of a sudden say, well, now we're going to change. We're going to shut it down. No, you're not going to shut it down. That is what you are. So you have to be taken down. And that's what's starting to occur on a global scale. And it's very messy. It's not neat. It's not clean. And it's only just beginning. And that's what you have to do. And so, now, so, a key figure in all of this is a man with a history that's very sordid. His name is George Soros. He played a very key role in setting all of these structures up. He also played a very key role in organizing for these wars. You know, the responsibility to protect, the humanitarian wars, all of this. He played a very key role in founding all the open societies that broke down the rules. He spent money from the drug trade, primarily, which is invested in his funds. He put billions and billions of dollars of that money into operations in Eastern Europe, operations in the United States, operations in every country in the world, to break down the society's laws with respect to banking regulations and everything else like that, as well as promoting the idea that the global community has to intervene in all these countries under humanitarian cover. But it's really a new imperialism. It's a new imperialism of the type that the British did in the 1800s. It's a new kind of imperialism. Right? So he's a very sordid guy. Now, to understand George Soros, you have to understand that as a teenager, he was involved with the Nazis in Austria, in putting people away in death camps, and also taking all their assets and everything else like that. So he was involved in this, and he says to this day that this was the most exciting time of his life. This was the greatest moment and most exciting time of his life. He's very open about it. So this guy has played a very key role in helping to create the structures over a long period of time, 40 years, since the 60s, creating these structures that we're talking about. So we have a gathering storm in this area. We have a gathering storm in this area, which is growing, and we'll see more coming out in the next 2 weeks to follow. But also, you have another gathering storm that's been quietly building up in the legal world. Because once this LIBOR thing comes out, this is criminal. We got ripped off. The cities got ripped off. The small banks got ripped off. The retail brokerage houses got ripped off. It's illegal. So lawsuits. Okay, so you have a gathering storm of lawsuits. And the city of Baltimore and the firefighters have gone into court with a lawsuit against the banks for setting them up in these interest rate swaps. And the judge has amended the case so that any city, county, whatever, can join in a class action suit against all these banks named. So this is just the beginning. A small community bank in, I think it's Wisconsin, Sheboygan, something like that, has done something similar. And now it's opening up to include the community banks, the retail stockbrokers, you know, that handle people's investment portfolios and so forth and so on. Like, you know, I don't know, there's some, what?
Financial advisors.
Yeah, financial advisors and so forth. These are like the Jones or something like that. I forgot all the name of them. But there's a whole bunch of these things. And there's, you know, they have little storefront offices in little towns all over the place. And they're going to be part of the suit as well. So you have a gathering storm in this. Now, Geithner is under attack because there's evidence that he was involved in promoting the rigging of the interest rates back in 2008 when and now he and Mervyn King, the head of the Bank of England, are accusing each other of different things, and there's this thing going on between them. So this is all part of this. Now, Geithner was the guy who was head of the New York Federal Reserve, which is the principal branch of the Federal Reserve involved with the bigger banks. A lot of the other Federal Reserve are involved more with the local, regional banks, because they don't. But New York City being the center, and the New York Fed being the center of it, historically, the New York Fed chairman is often more powerful in certain ways than even the Federal Reserve chairman himself, in terms of, because they're directly interfacing with the bank. So he was involved, and he was meeting extensively with the head of Barclays and doing this and so forth. So this is all now going to be a fight around these sort of things. And the fight is emerging in Congress, but it's actually being driven more from the British side at this point. But there is this collaboration emerging, hopefully, and it accelerates between the two, between the elements in Britain and the United States. And Eliot Spitzer, who was railroaded by these people out of office, and he was going after them when he was the Attorney General, State Attorney General in New York. He's now surfacing and saying a lot of things to this effect. So, so that's the gathering storm in the financial realm and in the realm. Now, as the process occurs where people become aware of just how criminal, and it hasn't really filtered down, but most cities have lost money in these interest rate swaps. Every city, every major city has lost some significant amount of funds. And so you don't have a fire department, you have to shut down schools, you have to shut down this, you have to shut down that. That's all can be related to this criminal activity. So that's what we're looking at. And that's, as that process goes on. Now we are going to accelerate that process. We had a situation in California on last Tuesday, where a significant sized city in the hundreds of thousands of people, San Bernardino, which is a big suburb of east of Los Angeles, had a city council meeting on their plan to declare bankruptcy. And after 4 hours of bickering between everybody, pointing fingers at everybody, our organizer was called upon, and she delivered a briefing on the reality of this criminal activity of LIBOR and the effect this has had on San Bernardino and other countries, that it's not San Bernardino, it's the whole system, and Glass-Steagall. And as she was talking, the city council members were checking out their laptops and starting to go in and check this all out. And by the end of the meeting, all the city council members were making appointments to meet with us and so forth and so on. And a lot of people in the audience were able to make the transition from bickering among themselves to realizing that what is going on in San Bernardino is not different than what's going on in Greece or Spain or anywhere else. So this is the kind of interventions that we're trying to make in the United States. Now, so you have a gathering storm there, and then you have the flip side of this is another gathering storm. Okay? This apparatus is sensing its end, and it's going for war. It's unleashing a wave of terror around the world, not just to distract, but to trigger a war. And the three most significant terrorist incidents in the last few days, one is inside Russia, in a place called Kazan, where the leadership of the Muslim community in Russia was targeted for assassination by radical Salafist elements, the radical fundamentalists being financed through Saudi Arabia and Qatar. This is a direct attack on Russia. This is a destabilized Russia because they have a large Muslim population, and so far the Muslim population has been relatively moderate, but there's a massive effort being done to destabilize Russia through the Muslim population. The second terrorist incident was very sophisticated inside job that took out the defense minister of Syria, the head of Syrian intelligence, two other top generals. This was a blow directly at the heart of the functioning of the Assad regime, which is the intelligence military component. Okay, and it was so sophisticated an operation involving somebody on the inside that it is believed that nobody but the Mossad could have carried this out. And one day before the assault, the leading government official in Israel said that Assad was finished, he's going to come down. And so now the U.S. most countries have condemned the act. The Obama administration has not. Even the British have condemned the act, but not the Obama administration. Okay. Then you had the third terrorist incident in Bulgaria, Israeli tourist bus. And it's within an hour after it occurred, Bibi Netanyahu has said that this was done by Hezbollah and Iran and that they're going to take action. And then the following day, Obama said it was probably done by Hezbollah and Iran. So, we are now back to a crisis with Israel and Iran, that's back on immediately, and you have the Syrian situation becoming more problematic. So this is the counter-reaction to this process. So you have that storm unfolding in the context of the other storm unfolding. And so now the Russians and the Chinese in turn have intensified their resistance to all of this. The head of the Russian delegation at the United Nations, TÜRKİYEM, has said that this humanitarian offensive is nothing but aggressive imperial actions on the part of of. So now we go to the victory and defeat of the European monetary stability arrangement. Germany passed it in June of 29th. Italy Parliament just passed a treaty that essentially abolishes their existence as a sovereign nation. Ireland passed it under massive pressure. Spain, I don't know about Spain, all these other countries, but essentially all these countries' parliaments are caving into the pressure and passing these bills. And who are the people behind the push for the bailouts and the push for the European Stability Mechanism and the European Stability Fund, which essentially takes over Europe? Well, it's the same people we're talking about. It's this financial system. It's the LIBOR crowd. Now that they are doing this, however, you had 1 million people demonstrating in Spain. It's getting out of control. You have the German Constitutional Court going to make a decision on this in September, which for this kind of thing is a long ways away. And the International Monetary Fund has just published a prospectus that says that the European Union will not hold. This thing is not going to work. It won't work. There are incredible pressures building for countries to break with the euro. There's incredible crises in the financial system. The debt that Spain has to be is now, the new figure is now another 400 billion euros to bail out the Spanish banks. It's just, and even though they passed this thing, it's not going to work. The political pressure is building. Plus, there's now an increasing opposition. Plus, there's the beginning of the LIBOR thing also hits back and hits the credibility of these layers in Europe as well. So the implications of all of this is that we now have an open war everywhere in the world, with forces lining up or being forced to come out of the woodwork to line up against this empire, against what I just described. And this financial crowd of criminals and drug money launderers and just absolute, the greatest criminality we've ever seen in the history of mankind, essentially not only coming under attack, but retaliating. So you have this process going on, and it's going to accelerate. And the faction of the oligarchy that wants to wipe these criminals out is the faction that is partly responsible for allowing them to get to this point and using them for their purposes. But now they have to change the game, and that's always the problem with these people. Is when they decide to change the game, they got a mess on their hands. They have to eat their own. But they can't just do it their way or any which way. There's only one way they can do it, and that's to build up the economy after the Glass-Steagall is implemented through a credit system. They have to go with them. You can't just have Glass-Steagall and keep the same system. You have to go with a difference, because Asia's not going to go along. Asia's going to grow incredibly in the coming period. They're just going to take off because they've decided that that's the direction they want to go in. So all the green stuff is going to fall apart in the context of Glass-Steagall, because the green part, contrary to what most people might think, to a large degree is a product of the system that we're describing. Not directly, but the whole philosophy of not putting the money in the real development of the nation, but in these highly speculative gambling casinos, is often explained as ecology. That is, the forces that are doing this are rejecting development, but they're using ecology, the ecological arguments, to justify their intention of not investing in the nation, but in breaking the nation down. So it's not that the people out there running around thinking that we need to deindustrialize and depopulate and, you know, make the planet, you know, less people and all of this. But it's they're being essentially told these things from the standpoint of an imperial system that is absolutely opposed to development. But they can't come out and say we're absolutely opposed to development. So they go with the environmental cover of stopping development, because stopping development can't be, you can't just say, well, we don't want you to eat. We don't want you to have this. We don't want you to have that. You shouldn't have it. Well, why not? Because, right? So that's the whole green movement to a large extent is a because, to cover for this fight. But if they get wiped out and Glass-Steagall gets implemented, then the effect will be, because you want development, you'll have a different, the green movement will essentially start to break apart, and people won't be so, the hardcore, you know, propaganda behind the green movement will start to abate in the context of Glass-Steagall. So these are the two pillars of the system that are now coming under attack. The money laundering, the drug trade. The Hong Shang Bank is the premier institution in this, and the LIBOR, which is the premier mechanism for the control of the world financial system. So now we come to our deployment. Okay, I regret to tell you that the U.S. Congress recesses, unfortunately, at the end of 2 weeks from now. So there are 2 weeks to make a profound impact in Congress. Then they recess until September, and that's not a good period because they're not in Congress, and that means they can't lynch anybody during that period, and that's not a good thing. So what the LaRouche movement has been doing for many decades and for many years, we've been going to these congressmen and talking to their aides and talking to the congressmen. And we've had a fluctuation of interest and then closing the doors, and then interest and closing the doors, and then interest and closing the doors. It's been a process that's been going on. The Glass-Steagall fight, in part, in whatever is going on in Congress with that, is largely a part of that process. It's not that we are the government, and it's not that we even are that big, but most of the population is not involved in a meaningful dialogue on policy. And so we're the only thing that's involved in, we tend to be the only group that's involved in a meaningful dialogue on policy that is beyond just the local interests of, or these special interests or local interests or whatever the people have. So our presence in Washington, D.C. at this time is very crucial in terms of being a part of the process of government, not the government. We're not the government, but it's part of the process of governing, because these congressmen are now starting to wake up to the reality of the financial collapse, of the LIBOR, of all these things. And we're collaborating with some of these people, but the key thing is it's not even the collaboration, it's the discussion process. It's so important because they're not getting that discussion process from the media. They're not getting that discussion process from necessarily the media. I mean, some of it's appearing in the media, but they're not really getting it. So these next 2 weeks, we're planning on having 40 organizers. We're taking the scientific cadre in the basement and our propaganda cadre in a place called Percival, and we're putting them all together. And the 3 most important days are Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Monday they're coming in, and Friday they're going out. So you want to hit them. The next 3 days are Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So this is what our job. And not go there and meet with them for 15 minutes, and then we're going to keep coming back again and again throughout the day to talk to this aide, to talk to that aide, to talk to the congressman, carry on the discussion and debate on these policies. Because now, in the last week, the signers on Glass-Steagall stopped at 70. and they've been at roughly 70. In the last week, we've had 5 people come on board, and there's going to be more, and it's going to open up. So, so that's our function right now, and in the next 2 weeks, we have to get across to these people that Obama has to go. Obama has to be dumped, and he can be dumped. There's this whole issue of his birth certificate. There's this whole issue of the leaks, intelligence leaks. There's this whole issue of Geithner. There's the whole issue of the protection of the Hong Kong Bank. There's the whole issue of LIBOR. All of this leads to the Obama administration in one form or another. And so we're at a point where if there's massive escalation in this, we may get a break. The thing may break, and then Obama is gone. In the sense that he won't be the nominee. You'll have an open convention, and then we take out. After that, we can take out, or a lot of the Republicans can take out Romney as well. So you get But this is revolutionary, and it may seem to most people, if not to all people, as unrealistic, unrealizable, an impossibility. But that's what has to be done, and you have to do what has to be done. And if these people are serious in Great Britain, this oligarchy, they got to go for it. We're going for it. If other people are serious, they're going to have to go for it. You can't. There's no. It doesn't. It's not a question of whether you can do it or not. It has to be done. And so essentially, that is where we are. So I'm going to stop this part of it right now and welcome you to our next meeting, August 4th. Okay. Focus on the Hong and the Shang because of their notoriety in the both current and past. Now, in 1977, the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank made a move to purchase the stock in the Marine Midland Bank, which is primarily an upstate bank in New York. And this was the portal for bringing the drug money legally through Hong Kong Shanghai Bank into the U.S. Okay. Up to that point, there was a lot of drug consumption developing in the U.S., heroin, cocaine, etc. But the funds were leaving the country, and it was very difficult to launder the money, and the funds would leave the United States, but it was very hard to integrate the profits from the drug traffic into the takeover of the U.S. economy. So this was a move by Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. And our movement made a huge issue of this takeover. And we led a campaign to get the New York Bank superintendent, at that time was Muriel Siebert. We led a campaign to get her to reject. Hello, this is the July 21st Burnaby Baruch meeting. The next one will be August 4th, Saturday, August 4th at 6:30 in Burnaby. And by then, things might be very different. And again, if you wish to find out the specific address, email me at Paul, P-A-U-L, Glumaz, G-L-U-M-A-Z, @gmail.com. Okay. Tonight, I'm going to start with a tale from the crypt of my past. I'm going to take you back to approximately 3 years after I became active with LaRouche in 1977. I was active in upstate New York and Ontario. In that period of time, I was active in upstate New York and Ontario. And what I'm going to discuss tonight is a battle that took place between 1977 and 1980. This battle was around a bank that at that time was called Hong Shang. Because of us, they changed their name to HSBC. They didn't want to focus the authorization of the takeover of Marine Midland Bank unless Hong Kong Shanghai Bank showed its books. And Hong Kong Shanghai Bank refused to show its books. So a 4-year battle emerged in which all kinds of pressures were brought upon Muriel Siebert from the governor, from the Federal Reserve, especially after Volcker became head of the Federal Reserve in 1978, to force this to occur. And the battle lines developed into the state legislature of New York, and our friends in the New York State Legislature put a bill to stop the takeover. The governor, Kerry, launched a campaign against those state legislators. This thing culminated in the purchase of Marine Midland Bank in 1980, 51% purchase of Marine Midland Bank by the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. But in the process of this campaign, a lot of forces came around to the bigger picture of the drug trade and the bigger picture of who was running the drug trade and the financial side of the drug trade. And this led to a lot of entities coming to us from law enforcement, international, domestic, intelligence people, many, many different forces came to us with the evidence and the knowledge of what was really going on. And out of this whole process came a book in 1978 called Total Furor. And our campaign caused the Total Furor. And it's about that time that the forces that are still trying to stop us came into crudescence, sort of, came into a kind of together. They came together. It's around 78, 79, 80, 81. All the people who have been out to slander LaRouche, you know, the Queen of England runs drugs, political extremist, cult, everything stems from the 78 battle, 77 to 80 battle, where essentially we drew blood with this analysis, with the evidence, in this book and everything. And one of the leading people who made his profession going after LaRouche, he wrote a book on it, was Dennis King. Another one was Chip Burley. And they were both involved as reporters and writers for High Times magazine. This whole apparatus came after us. Canon West of St. John the Divine Cathedral was a top level of the British in the U.S. told us that the British would not go after us directly, but they would sick their Jewish friends on us, meaning the ADL. And sure enough, the ADL went on a total campaign. LaRouche is an anti-Semite, LaRouche is a racist, LaRouche is this, LaRouche is that. And then we countered with another campaign showing that the leadership, historical leadership of the ADL had nothing to do with Judaism. It was in Dope Incorporated. And what was unique about Dope Incorporated was it didn't go into, it went into the concept of the drug traffic as a top-down organized structure, not as a bottom-up organized structure, but as a top-down organized structure centered on the banking side. And going back in history to the Opium Wars in China, and the way the China Opium War worked, the way the opium trade went into China, and how this was same principle was being replicated in the context of the Vietnam War, in the context of this whole process. And then we did an overlay of the growth of organized crime in the United States and the people involved in the Kennedy assassination, and we did a whole series of things to connect, and out of this came a conception of an imperial activity that was growing and growing in power, and that if you wanted to take down the drug trade, you couldn't do it by simple interdiction or rounding up all of the drug addicts or what have you. You had to go for the banking system. You had to go for the banking side as the first way you take it down. You don't. So now you have to understand that this caused a lot. This book, which unfortunately did not circulate as many in the millions. It was significant, but it wasn't in the millions. This book caused a